Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of GOG Partners Clinical Trials Education. I'm Dr. Kathleen Moore from the Stevenson Cancer Center in Oklahoma City, and today I'm so excited to be joined by one of my very good friends, and I guess we overlapped by 1 year, so kind of were one of my former fellows, but we were almost fellows together, I feel like. Dr. Karen Matthews, who is at Brown.
Good morning.
Good morning. And today we're going to talk about kind of a dry topic, but I think we'll still make it interesting. We're going to talk about internal roadblocks that you need to overcome when you're opening a trial. Like, what are sort of the operational things to negotiate contracts and budgets for a clinical trial that you're interested in opening at your site? So I'm really glad to have Dr. Matthews here, because even though we're both at sort of quote unquote academic institutions, we're actually not, and our operations are very different. So we'll give you kind of two flavors, there's probably 5 flavors of how we approach opening a trial at our site. So I'm going to start with you, and we can just call it, you were friends, so I'm just going to call you Kara, you can call me Katie. So your approach, we're all approached by studies from a number of directions. GOG Partners, you get sort of an email, usually with the synopsis, but at least an email announcing a new study, or you may get emails from contract research organizations, like with some very cryptic message, like, are you interested in a new trial for ovarian cancer? And you're like, sure, I'm interested. So you get one of those emails and you're like, oh, new trial in ovarian, I'm interested. What's next at your site?
And so with those trials, Katie, we pretty much always say, yes, we're interested, because you never know what's behind that window. And exactly. Then kind of the next step is proceeding with the CDA and the confidentiality disclosure agreement, so that you have the ability to see what that mystery drug is. And so for us, that's a process that we have to run through our hospital attorneys. They're not in-house, but it's a group that we contract with. And so we have a process where we immediately forward that to our research office, and then that gets sent to review.
Yeah, and so so I want to step back a little bit, just so we can tell the audience sort of the differences between our sites. So I'm at the University of Oklahoma, kind of fully academic institution. Tell me kind of how you're structured for your research.
Yeah, so we are, I think, educationally a very academic site with a fellowship through Brown, but our GYN oncology specific group is within the Women's Hospital, which is a separate corporation from the kind of main hospital system. And so we run a division of GYN oncology research within our group, within the corporation.
So you don't have kind of the traditional academic committee and structure and backing around opening trials. It has a different route.
Correct. And I would say in some ways it is difficult, and we're almost more like a smaller, maybe private practice group. And we don't have the same university resources and support, although we can ask questions to the university, but it also gives us some flexibility and independence to really do what we want to do. So it has both the positive and the negative side, I would say.
Awesome. And I mean, I think that's great for a lot of our folks who are listening, who are at more private centers and sort of interested in that aspect. How do you, when you don't have the kind of academic monster or machine, however, today I'm feeling like it's a monster, but usually it's a machine. When you don't have that sort of this step, how do you get things done? And so this will be an important conversation on both sides to talk about. So the CDA is the confidentiality disclosure agreement. And that, as you said, allows you to see the synopsis or sometimes the protocol, depending on the sponsor. And I think one thing I would just say to our younger clinical trialists or rising clinical trialists is that you'll get a lot of these, and they kind of become, you're like, CDA, sign it. But you do have to be very cautious about them because they're real. So you really have to keep things confidential. And so I struggle with that sometimes. I'll just tell you, because I get really excited about a trial. Like, I hear about a trial that's coming and I'm like, oh, I really want this trial. I'm so excited about it. And then, I'm at a meeting or I'm with some friends and I'm like, oh, I just heard about this really amazing trial that's coming. That's a breach of the CDA. until the trial is open and in the public domain. So a lot of times these aren't in the public domain when the CDA comes out, and it's in the public domain when it's on clinicaltrials.gov. So that's sort of your marker. When you see it appear up there, you can start talking about how excited you are in public. But before then, you have to be a little careful. We have had incidental disclosures, not with malice. People are just excited to talk about a trial and put a slide up at a national meeting, and then the sponsor will be sitting there like, oh, okay. So just watch that. Trying to give you some tips and tricks to avoid mistakes that have been made by some of us in the past. So at my institution, I'm at, as I said, academic institution, CDAs have to be routed. So even though it's a simple CDA, I'm not allowed to sign any contracts. I will get in a lot of trouble. So I have to route them through my university contracts office. That adds a layer. It doesn't take that long, but it does add a layer of time when you're thinking about things. And so it would be important for you, wherever you are, to just ask the question and understand the rules. Can you sign your own CDA if you're interested in just considering a trial? And the answer may be yes, and then you just docu-sign it and send it back, or no, you cannot and you need to route it. And unless you ask, sometimes people don't remember to tell you these little things. So so be sure you know that piece. So that's kind of step one. So we've signed
the Katie, I was going
yeah.
to add to that. I tried to change it at my institution so I could sign them, and I got the no. So it might be something that you can push on a little bit, because I thought it would have saved us a few weeks. And I think knowing, and then you can always ask if you can change the process.
Yeah, and they always can say no, but sometimes they'll say yes, because it does shave a few weeks off, which adds up. So so that's the CDA. So we do the same. It's very rare that we're like, nah, we're not interested in even seeing. We always want to look at it, even if we have 18 trials. We're like, no, see it. Just look, we don't look at it. So we both said yes to the CDA. Now what happens?
So then typically once we review whether either the synopsis or the protocol, we have a better sense of whether the trial is a good fit for us, both in terms of whether we have some of the necessary elements of the trial and whether it's a population that we have a need.
Yeah, and so when you say, right, I think there's gonna be a separate one of these videos about how you assess a trial in terms of your population and palate. So we won't get into that today. This is more kind of the operational aspects. So say it fits your palate. How do you assess whether or not you have the resources at this step? Because this is a critical step.
Right, and a lot of times at this point, you'll have to fill out some sort of synopsis about what your resources are. And so some of those questions are about your population, but also things like, do you have the ability to collect these labs and ship them? What's your shipping process? Do you have a -80 freezer? Is there some sort of specific safety monitoring committee that's necessary? Do you need a biosafety committee? Do you have those resources available to you at your institution? And we actually sometimes don't have the ability at our institution to have specific infectious, like viral vectors with our pharmacy hoods. That's an example of something we don't have. So I've had to turn down a couple of trials for a certain kind of a pharmacy safety level.
Right. Those are the key points. So I'm just going to summarize that. Because a lot of times in my institution is, and I'll ask you, who fills out the questionnaire you're talking about? It's called a feasibility FQ, or it's called a PIQ sometimes, feasibility questionnaire. Who fills that out at your site?
The way we've kind of delegated responsibility is we have a senior research personnel who is responsible and fills it out with whoever would be our site PI. And so it's done together. And a lot of times it becomes a rubber stamp for a lot of questions. Do we have a -80 freezer? Yes. Do we have the shipping ability? Yes. And then there's some questions that the research staff might know that are more specific to the PI. So it's done in concert.
Yeah. I think we're the same. And so really knowing, some sites, it's all the PI does it. Some sites, the PI's like sends it off and says, fill this out. Some sites refuse to fill them out because they're a waste of time. We can't do that. So those are the key things. So at your site, again, some smaller sites, private practices, and even smaller academic sites, do you have a -80 freezer? That's a big thing. Not everyone does. So you may be at a site and you're like, oh, sure we do. I'm sure we do somewhere. Ask. because you may not. And we actually have had studies that were sites that were selected and they go out to do the SIV and they in fact do not have that because there's just a misunderstanding of what that actually is. So -80 freezers are becoming a bigger thing, a need in terms of clinical trials. So if that's asked, find out. You can ask your pharmacy. We have a feasibility committee that reviews ours. And those of you that NCI designated cancer centers, there's multiple review committees that have to look at these. And our feasibility committee will look at the freezers. They'll look at what you said, if it needs an IBC. Do you have one locally? If you don't, there are central IBCs, but they have to have a local component. So you have to find experts that are willing to serve on your IBC and then contract with like WERB or Advera to have this central IBC in place. We've done that. And it took a bit. It was not a straightforward, easy process. It took quite a bit to get it in place for a study that ended up closing. So it's not a good use of resources, but at least it's there now. So if you're a little site and maybe you're going to put 1 or 2 patients on this study, that just may not be, referring back to Dr. Meyer's talk, that just may not be where you put your resources if you have sort of to prioritize. So you really have to think about that. Some phase 3 studies want PKs. Can you do PKs?
Yeah,
Can you centrifuge them? Look real particular. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that's a really good point about the IBC, because we had a study that I really wanted to open, and I found out we had reciprocity with an IBC in town because of another research group in our hospital. And so I ended up being able to use this IBC by Googling my options and finding. And so I think sometimes just asking the question, and it was an extremely slow process the first time we went through it. And similar to your study, we ended up never getting anyone on that trial, very disappointingly, because it was awesome. And I felt like, okay, at least we know the process now. We really learned a lot. And the next time we're going to be way better at doing it. So I think sometimes even if you end up with a specific trial failure, it broadens your scope and helps with the next one.
Yeah, your capabilities for later. Absolutely. And then you brought up the hoods. So I think, again, for folks that are just sort of getting into the mix of clinical trials, having a relationship with if you have an investigational drug pharmacist, an IDS pharmacist, a lot of places don't, but they have just great pharmacists in their infusion center. And again, Dr. Myers brought this up, make relationships with the key people in your cancer center or your infusion center so you can run a protocol by them. Because, when pharmacists look at things, they'll be like, oh, this would be really difficult to operationalize here. I only have 1 hood, and this requires use of a hood for 6 hours. So we would be down a hood. We wouldn't be able to do this, or we wouldn't be able to infuse anyone else for these 6 hours. Those are operational things that, I know now, but I didn't know probably even as close as 5 years ago. So involve people in looking at these protocols, unless they're just Taxol Carbo plus something. So you can just overcome some of those barriers up front. So that gets you kind of to the PSV or the pre-site visit where that's all assessed. And sometimes it's kind of not a great use of your time, but it's a requirement to be site selected. So now you're site selected. They've said you can participate. And now you're all excited. You're like, you get the letter. Woo, I'm selected. I'm so excited about this study. I do feel that I have a study that's about to get an SIV. I'm so excited about it. It's actually the Veristem low-grade study. I'm so excited. And I've just been sitting on my contracts and budgets people legitimately, like get it open, get it open. So what do you do? What are the pitfalls? Let's start with the clinical trials agreement, or the CTA. What do you do with that?
Yes. So similarly to our CDA, we have to forward our CTA and route it internally for our admin folks to start reviewing and to start reviewing the contract and going back and forth. And a lot of times in our institution, at least, I hear that there's going back and forth and I'm copied on emails, but I'm not directly involved. It seems like it's a lot of legalese and negotiation between our administrative folks and the sponsor. But I don't know if that's the same for you.
Yeah, I think so. Same. We have to, as I said, I have to route everything. And sometimes I feel like with some of the bigger pharmaceutical companies that have worked with us in the past, so there's sometimes common language that's already been worked out. They go really well. Oftentimes when there's a new company or a smaller company, at least for us, again, I'm an academic institution and a state institution. So our state has very particular language that has to be in the contract and in the ICF, really surrounding patient injury language, and then other things like that really remove me. All the contract is with the Board of Regents. So there's a lot of state-based language that most companies are comfortable with, but some aren't. And so there have been occasions where my contracts get stuck in this infinity loop between the sponsor and my office. And so I guess my advice would be, and it's hard when you're a busy clinician, like you send it off and then you get busy and then 3 months goes by and you're like, where's my study? And it's in this infinity loop of argument. And you just have to kind of step in and go, hey, this thing and this thing are this way. And they're like, oh, okay. And it gets done. So you do have to, if you don't have a big regulatory office sort of working with you, which I have and I'm blessed by, but most people don't. Sometimes you have to have like a calendar reminder. You check in at 4 weeks or something like that. What you do.
Yeah, it's interesting because we outsource this. It's not in-house counsel that reviews our contracts. And so we have a couple of times gone back to the drawing board with them and asked for a time commitment as well, because a lot of it depends on how busy they are. And so sometimes there's a really quick turnaround and sometimes it has taken, like you said, weeks and weeks. You're like, hey, what's going on with this study? And so we've a couple of times kind of gone back to that drawing board as well with that commitment.
Yeah, I think that's so I think the kind of big advice is, again, understand your institutional rules so you don't run afoul of them. It's really unusual for a PI to sign the CTA. And that may be, we were just talking, there may be some private, we have some great examples of clinicians in the community or powerhouses in enrollment, and they're like their single shingle gyn-onc. I'm honestly in awe of that. Maybe they do, and so we should get that information for you, but for most groups, you are not signing it. And it's kind of important because the CTA has the language about indemnification and patient injury, and you really want to have the signatory on that being a corporation in Dr. Matthews' case or institution in my case. So really understanding that is quite important. What about, so is it different with, so pharmaceutical studies come to us through GOG partners and then outside GOG partners. Does that process differ at your institution?
Yeah, a little bit. So at the same time that we are starting the CTA, we also internally start our own kind of IRB submission process. And for the NCI studies, we do use the CIRB, but for our GOG Foundation trials, we use GOG partners, we use our own local IRB. And so that at some time points can be a process that takes a little bit longer as well. So we try to get that going immediately. And then the last thing that we're really kind of trying to move forward concurrently is starting to review the budget, because at the same time that the contract is being negotiated, we're also trying to start working on the budget. And for the GOG Partners trial, that is a little bit different because a lot of times those budgets really come to us, and it's a benefit. We see those as ones that move forward more quickly because the budget has already been solidified and we don't have to go back and forth with a sponsor about what the reimbursement fee is going to be for the serum BMP. And so that process, I think, through GOG partners is actually a little bit more streamlined.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that the same is true as you were talking is with the contracting, because GOG partners has in-house legal that kind of really works on the contracting with the company before it comes to you. That contract has been pretty well vetted. Now it still has to go through each institution, but it's been pretty well vetted. And there is quite a bit of operational support within GOG partners for taking a little bit of the, probably a lot of the onus off the investigator, keeping things moving forward, because we have a team that reaches out to your regulatory folks or your contract folks about where things are and what step in the CTA are we about to execute? Is it with final signature? So there's quite a big team kind of providing some support in the background, because it's really in our interest to get sites up and running as quickly as possible for sponsors as a site management organization. And so I think that that's another kind of big benefit to working with GOG partners for pharmaceutical studies, because if you know that you're at a small site and you don't have this sort of machine behind you to help negotiate contracts, you actually do have a machine behind you with GOG partners, and some mentorship as well, which I think we'll talk about. And then the budget's the same thing, right? The budgets are negotiated to be favorable to our sites. We're not trying to like make money, but we are trying to not be loss leaders, and we're trying to cover expenses. But running a trial at a site is a lot of money. It's a lot of oversight. It's a lot of extra tests and visits and data folks and all of your team working on things, and all those people have to be reimbursed for their time. And so the contracts are negotiated in such a way that you can cover costs fairly at your institution, and it justifies the extra time the PI is spending enrolling a patient to an important trial and overseeing their care. So I do think the budgets are very fairly negotiated, but you still have to do a little work at your end on the budget, don't you?
Yeah, we do a lot of trying to calculate, for example, for our own institution, how many people we think are going to be enrolling on the trial and where we're going to need to allocate resources within our kind of research group.
Yeah. So it's very key to sort of understand that. If you're like, I'm going to put 10 people on this, that's amazing, do it. But make sure that you have the data managers and the staff to oversee that and meet your contract. So the contract will have like usually a number of days that the data has to be entered by. And as a high enrolling site, where our data people bust to try and keep up with that. So if you have kind of one like stalwart data manager, you just got to make sure that you don't overwhelm he or she with 10 trials at
exactly.
once.
RA time, data manager, all those different kind of resources that you need.
Yeah, so you really have to think through. That may be a good talk to go through like all the people that are involved, because you're like, I'm gonna open a trial, and the trickle down is this halo. It's all beneficial to the patient, but you have to have the support. I think for again, people that are just getting involved in this, there's a couple of things you have to understand about budgets just to stay in compliance. And that is that you'll at some level be asked to do a coverage analysis. And at our institution, I have to sign off on that. Do you have to sign off on your coverage analyses?
I don't at our institution.
So some sites will and some sites won't. And basically, I get a spreadsheet that lists every event for that patient, CTs, visits, labs, EKGs, PKs, whatever. Lists them out and then identifies what standard of care and what is just for the study. Because standard of care items are billed to insurance, and that's based on Medicare rules. And so the sponsors actually cannot pay for things that are standard of care for a patient on study, because that is considered fraud. So you have to be very careful that those coverage analyses are an invoice, because that's how it's invoiced. So you're invoicing things to sponsor that are just related to research. And honestly, I have a great budgets team that does that for me. So I understand it, but I don't really have to do the nitty gritty. But if you're at a smaller site and you're asked to do a coverage analysis, it's important for you to know standard of care is billed to insurance. You also have to understand what are called LCDs, local coverage determinants. So sometimes states have different rules, and you should be able to get someone to tell you if they differ from Medicare. Usually they don't, but just so you don't run afoul at your institution in billing. So it's just as my mentor, Scott McMeekin, used to say, there's an infinite number of reasons, both of our mentor, infinite number of ways to be screwed. That's a positive note. But so that was that's like one of the things I remember. So I am very careful about that. And so you do have to pay attention. Because you don't want to
essentially it becomes double dipping, right? Like that's the problem, is if you are billing, say, Medicare, and then you're also being reimbursed for a CAT scan by the study. That's when that's what you can't do.
So be cautious around that. Most institutions have a lot of protections around that, because they don't want to. I mean, no institution wants to be knowledgeably committing fraud, but you can do it just by oversight and no one's intention, but it doesn't matter. So you do have to be cautious there with the coverage analysis. And if people want more details on that, I've learned a lot in the last 10 years, and I'm happy to share. I'm always learning. But that would be my one kind of thing to watch for with budgets. What do you think? So, I mean, this is a lot, right? I've learned a lot from making mistakes. I'm going to tell you, I've made a lot of mistakes. I'm not perfect. And I've tried to learn from them and hopefully didn't harm my institution in the process. But what do you think? It's just a lot of stuff, Kara. How do you know all of this? Where do you go if you have questions? Because it's just a lot of legal stuff. Like, what if you get stuck?
Yeah, that's interesting because I was thinking as you're saying that about, it's so cliche, but I have learned the most from the mistakes that I have made. And so I think the other thing is that over time, things change, right? So we're doing things very differently than we were 10 years ago. And so how do you stay kind of current as well? And, I was very lucky that when I came to our institution, there was really a pretty good infrastructure in place. So I didn't have to start from scratch, like I think a lot of people may be trying to do right now. And so I think one is finding good experienced staff who kind of have the basics, so you're not hand-holding every step of the way. And then I always reach out still when I have questions to colleagues around the country who I know may have had similar questions or faced similar issues in the past. And then on our staff side, about 5 years ago, our staff started attending the SOCRA conference, the Society of Clinical Research Associates. And there's an annual meeting. And I think that's really helped them just in terms of what exactly you were talking about with some of the budget and contracts issues. We've really learned a lot. And I think it's really helped us to become stronger and more financially solvent as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And SOCRA is, even big site, small site, SOCRA is a great resource for clinical trial staff. Everyone it's mainly for kind of your administrative side, budgets, contracts, regulatory, data, et cetera. But also, I think also beneficial for clinical side just to understand that aspect because it's also integrated. But they network and they sort of they develop sort of just like we do, these sort of little friend groups that they can bounce things off of. So it's really helpful for them to have someone to go to if they've exhausted. I'll tell you at our institution, we're hiring right now for a budget specialist. So it's like me and my administrative lead trying to figure it out. And we reach out to also AACI when we have questions, because I'm not a budget expert. I'm like an anecdotal budget expert. So, I need a real one if someone knows of someone that needs a job. But but we do get a lot of good feedback from AACI as well. And they have a listserv. So we'll just go put a question in, like, what do you do here or there? And we get really knowledgeable people from more mature cancer centers answering us back. That's really been helpful. So we I don't ever feel like you're on an island, because you're not. It may feel like it, but there's just a virtual world of people that are super helpful.
And I think that's a really good point about the more mature cancer centers, because we are not in a cancer center. And so on our resources side within the hospital and the administration, we don't really have any resources. It's really us, and that's it. And so I find, the networks to be really like critical. I couldn't do it without asking other people questions.
Yeah. And I think asking folks, we were talking about this ahead of this little recording, when I am struggling, I will talk with my good friends across the country, some of which are at very, very long established cancer centers like Dana-Farber. Like I reach out to Joyce Liu and Ursula Machelonis all the time when I have questions about clinical trials operations and how they run their unit, because it is so well done and they're so helpful, and there's no but to that, but I can't replicate their unit in Oklahoma. And so then I have to kind of take that and figure out how to fit it into my world. So they're very helpful to me, as well as my similar units. Like the people at Kansas have been very helpful to me. The people at Kentucky have been very helpful to me. They're very similar size and demographic cancer centers and CTOs. We have similar challenges. So I try to get help from multiple sources, and then you always have to individualize it to your geography and your site to make it work. It's not, you can't just plug and play. Unfortunately, kind of what works here is not going to work where you are, and probably vice versa. So broad networks are really helpful. Yeah. I think that's probably overwhelmingly enough. We probably just scared everyone.
Really juicy topic.
I know. I thought it was like, this is gonna be kind of boring. But actually I was like, oh, all the things I've learned, but I wish I could just tell you all, don't do this, this, and this. But this was just meant to be a little bit of an overview of kind of the steps, just so you understand the language. CDA, PSV, pre-site visit, CTA, clinical trials agreement, budgets and contracts, kind of local determination costs, et cetera. Just so we use all these abbreviations. And if you are new to the landscape, it may just be this sort of wash of abbreviations that you've never heard. Letters, you're like, I don't know what they're talking about, or whether or not it's important for me to know. So we just wanted to kind of do this 101 broad overview of how we think about the operation, how to operationalize a clinical trial just in getting it to open. So I hope it was helpful. Do you have any last thoughts about this, Kara, before because you've been super successful where you are. I'm really proud of you.
Yeah, I have, I have great colleagues. We have great research staff as well, and they're so committed to our patients. I think that's really what it comes down to, is this is a commitment to our patients. And, we on our side as the clinicians are running these trials and getting access to these opportunities for drugs for our patients. And so I feel like I always have this much stronger desire to get a trial open than maybe some out of our administration council in terms of getting a contract signed. And so I think my biggest thing is just keep pushing. We want to do this for our patients, and we think this is the best clinical care for them as well. And I talk to our staff about this all the time, like, just keep pushing. We're going to learn, we're going to keep going, and just push.
Well, I don't think I could end on anything better than that. So we'll close this little video snippet. I hope you found it informative. We would love, as I always say this, we would love feedback. If there's things we need to go into more depth on, if there's topics we've completely skipped, please put some comments onto social media with this and let us know, and we'll get it on our docket to film. But I want to thank Dr. Matthews for taking time out of her busy Thursday to chat with me. It's so much fun to just sit and chat with someone. And I think we both have to get back to work, as you all probably do as well. And so we'll sign off for now. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.